Hi, Kate here with another video. Hope everyone is doing well. I'm here with another video. If you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. Helps me build the channel. Yeah, I'm at 124 subscribers, and I thank everyone who subscribed. It seems to be fluctuating somewhat. I was up to 127 at one point. I suspect YouTube might be unsubscribing people, or possibly, I've been around the online left long enough to know that, some people might have watched a video and gotten pissed off at something I've said. So, whatever. Other things in my life to worry about. I'm just going to keep making videos, but I am working to build the channel as well. So if you like my content, please like and subscribe. So I was going to make a video on Yemen last week, and I started to do it, but I'd have to do tons of research to do it justice. What's going on in Yemen is horrific, near genocidal, human tragedy. It's a horrific situation. U.S. is driving this, is a huge part of it. Saudi Arabia is a close U.S. ally. Although there's been somewhat of a rift, there's still a very big part. Saudi Arabia is a big part of U.S. imperialism. This is a horrific humanitarian catastrophe, getting very little attention in the media. Thing is, I almost made a video last week, but I have to do tons of research to really do it justice, and I wasn't really into it. Next weekend, I may make a video on Yemen. We'll see. And I'm always looking to interview people on this. So anyway, this Yemen war, the Ukraine conflict is getting a lot more publicity. You don't see like residential areas near where I work. People have Ukrainian flags up, like usually one every block. I don't see any Yemen flags, any Palestinian flags. The media virtually ignores this. One of the main reasons, of course, is that Ukrainians are white people. Not just that, they're not just white, they're Northern European. They're fair skin, light hair, blue eyes. They look Northern European. And they get more of a sympathetic play in the media. People identify with them more, want to identify with them. Even British journalists or American journalists have actually said this. Mainstream newscasters have actually said this. One BBC journalist, I forget who he was, he said something like, yeah, they're normal people. People of Ukraine are normal people. He said something like, they're semi-civilized people. He sort of said this indirectly, like all these black and brown people, they're always fighting each other. People in Eastern Europe are semi-normal. We're the normal people. We're us British or English. We're normal people. And the American news people who said very similar stuff. There's deeply ingrained implicit racism. That's a whole story. So Ukraine gets much more attention because they're Europeans and they look white. Not just look white, they look Northern European. Okay, so there's that. Now, this video is going to be on media narratives of the Ukraine conflict. Third video I made on Ukraine. A lot of interesting stuff. Okay, so there's media buzz, U.S. media narratives that Russia is losing, or Russia, they personalize as Putin. Putin is losing. Putin made a gamble, and now he's trying to get out of it. He took a risk, like now he's desperately got in over his head. He's trying to get out, desperately trying to figure out a way he can get out of Ukraine. He's gotten bogged down. First, the media narrative was that the Russians are losing, that the morale is bad, soldiers are defecting, Putin's going to be assassinated or overthrown, there's seething discontent in Russia. That was that was debunked. Now it's Putin got bogged down. It's always Putin got bogged. Now my take. That's nonsense. I'm watching a lot of alternate media. If you watch CNN, NPR, NBC, that's the nonsense. Don't watch corporate media. They'll lie. They don't tell you the truth at all. You have to be a critical thinker. Get media from a variety of different sources, and I'll explain where I get what sources I use. I've been trying to follow this fairly closely, and my take on it. Okay. First week or so, Russian leadership badly miscalculated. That is true. Apparently in 2014, something like 3/4 of the Ukrainian army fled when AWOL defected. They didn't have their heart in a war with the Russian population of Donbass. They didn't support this. They just melted away. And apparently when Russia invaded recently, they were expecting kind of the same thing. The Ukrainian military would melt away. That hasn't happened. They're in a much better situation than they were in 2014 and 2015. The Ukrainian officers are hardcore nationalists. I don't know what the recruits are, but the officers are hardcore nationalists. They're not going to flee. Different situation. So the Russians miscalculated. They like second week they realized this. Like after the first week, they kind of realized they had made a mistake, and they brought in. Originally, they did not bring in their seasoned veterans. They were new recruits. They didn't bring in their literally heavy artillery. Now they did. They realized they made a mistake, and they made up for it. Okay, now they are going slow. The Russians are going slow in Ukraine. They're doing it slowly and methodically. They are winning. Undeniably winning. Mariupol, I believe it's the third largest city in Ukraine. It's 1.5 million people. A major port in southern Ukraine is dominated by the Azov Battalion, neo-Nazi group. Mariupol is encircled, and most of the Ukrainian army, the vast majority of it, is in eastern Ukraine. It's being divided and encircled and squeezed into what the Russian military calls a cauldron. They're pushed in this cauldron. They're being destroyed. They're rapidly being destroyed. Most of the major cities in Ukraine are encircled. Kiev is encircled. You can still get in and out. The Russians have not blocked egress from in and out of the city, but it is largely encircled. The Russians are being very careful. They don't want an assault on the cities. Now, what I've read, according to Russian military way of making war, is different from the American way of making war. In Iraq, the U.S. had complete air superiority, and the idea was to destroy everything, bomb the shit out of the country, destroy the cities, and totally rebuild. It fits in with neoliberalism, the idea that the U.S. would rebuild Iraq from the oil from their own oil funds and build it in America's image, make it to a mini United States, well-connected American companies where we get contracts, and fits into neoliberal shock doctrine philosophy. Russia is a little different. They don't want to destroy the cities. They're not always nice guys. I mean, my understanding, the Chechen War, the Russian army was kind of brutal, was pretty brutal, my understanding of it. But in Ukraine, first, they want the Ukrainian people to like them. They whatever post-war settlement emerges, they don't want a hostile population. And also, they regard the Ukrainians as the same people, as related peoples. Putin actually wrote a really interesting article. Whatever you think of Putin, I don't politically support him. He is vastly more intelligent and cultured than any Western politician right now. Could you imagine Biden or anyone in U.S. leadership writing an article, a scholarly article about history? No, of course not. So the Russians are going very slowly and methodically. What I've read, the war will probably be over the middle or end of April, or very late April, very, very, at the very least, at the very beginning of May. Russia is decisively winning. They have control of the air. They have total control of the air. They're encircling the cities. They're not in Western Ukraine. They don't have any interest in Western Ukraine. That's the most anti-Russian part of the country. They don't really have any interest. The bulk of the Ukrainian military is in the east and being destroyed right now. Okay, that's so media narratives, U.S. media is pushing all this narrative. Russians are losing, they're not. Now, there's the idea of the no-fly zone. I have a coworker, really nice guy, a guy from El Salvador. He says he's a leftist, although he's non-political. And he says he's anti-capitalist, but he doesn't watch alternative media. He doesn't know anything. He listens to NPR, gets his news from NPR, CNN, like most people do. And he says his wife is a communist. Wife is in the communist wing of the Democratic Party. I don't know what that means. There's no such thing, of course, but many liberals. She's been active in NGOs and did some activism, I guess. A lot of liberals call themselves communists. Anyway, my friend from El Salvador, really nice guy, and I have a reputation in my job to be like I'm the Ukraine expert. Not that I'm an expert by any means, but I know vastly more than most Americans. Okay, so my friend asked me that what's wrong with the no-fly zone? The media was pushing this buzz of a no-fly zone, and pundits were debating it. Nobody actually said what a no-fly zone is. So I said, what's wrong? Okay, what's wrong with a no-fly zone is, what's a no-fly zone all about? It means planes are shot down over Ukraine. The US and NATO would shoot down planes flying over Ukraine. And who dominates the airspace? Russia. My friend did not know this, but Russia controls most of the airspace over Ukraine. It means US would shoot down Russian planes over Ukraine, which means there would be war, a full-scale war between the US and Russia, and both countries are nuclear powers. They have the highest number of nuclear weapons in the world between them. So, okay, my friends, okay, my coworkers, okay, I get it. The media doesn't explain any of this. The corporate media doesn't explain, creates this buzz for a no-fly zone, but doesn't explain what it actually is. Another one of my coworkers asked me, mentioned some atrocity. The Russians bombed some village and killed 30 people. Said, my answer is, I don't know. I don't know about that particular incident. I'm not going to apologize for every single thing everybody does. There's a huge amount of media distortion on all sides. This is a war. First casualty of wars is what they call fog of war. The first casualty of any war is truth. I'd be extremely skeptical, especially U.S. media narratives. The local newspaper, local rag, the Portland Press Herald, their headline was last week was, Russians begin indiscriminately bombing civilians. Well, that's nonsense. That's simply not true. I know they are, everything I read, they're not doing this. I'm not saying atrocities haven't been committed. I'm not saying horrible things haven't happened, but that's not true. I do know that's not true. They're not. Anyway, but that's anyway, so I explained that. So my coworker, another coworker asked me, what do the Russians want? Why are they doing this? Putin seems like a madman, just unprovoked attack on what? Well, I explained, of course, the Russians want three things, 3 or 4 demands, really. They want Ukraine to be neutral, want in the Ukrainian constitution, saying that Ukraine will not join NATO. They want denazification. They are not bona fide Nazi groups. They want presumably trials, and somehow get rid of these Nazi groups. They want recognition of the 2 breakaway Russian-speaking republics in what was Eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk. They want official recognition. And now they want Ukrainian recognition of Crimea as a part of Russia. That's what they want. And the peace negotiations have been going, the negotiations between the Zelensky, Ukrainian government, and Russians have been going on for a while. Negotiations seem like they're bullshit. It basically seems that Zelensky will say, yeah, maybe I don't like NATO, we're not going to join NATO, but then he'll back away. It appears, is widely believed from alternate media sources, that the Americans won't let Zelensky surrender. All he has to do is agree to this. All he has to do, but the U.S. is pushing him very hard not to give in. U.S. hardliners. U.S. imperialism is fighting this war to the last Ukrainian. Ukrainian people are suffering. The story. Yeah, back to my story. There's the Ukrainian people are suffering. There's a story going around, Buzz, that Zelensky isn't even in Kiev. Buzz is in Warsaw. Some people say he's at the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw or somewhere in Poland. I believe the story first came from a Czech alternate media outlet, and then what's her name? Abby Martin mentioned this in the panel discussion. And then there's a pic of John Helmer, who's an American, lives in Russia, alternate media, written books on Russia. He has a theory that the meeting that recently took place last week between some Eastern European leaders and Zelensky, as they show solidarity, actually took place in Poland. The meeting was basically faked. I have no idea if this is true or not. There are a zillion ideas. I have no idea if it's true or not. As far as Zelensky, the media's built him up as a folk hero, as a hero. Well, he's a comedian, background as a comedian. In fact, Alex Rubinstein of the Gray Zone called him SNLinsky. Some of his comedy skits were at one point, I'm not making this up, he apparently played a piano with his penis. It's on YouTube, and it doesn't show it, but his backdrop, it's kind of implied him and this other guy were, I imagine it would be pretty painful, but some of his comedy skits were pretty weird, but okay. Well, okay, anyway, there's this oligarch named Igor Kolomoisky. He's a kingpin, Ukraine, multi-billionaire, very powerful guy. He started a bank with several other people, collapsed his own bank, laundered the money through the U.S. Now, there's a small Messianic Habib Jewish sect, Messianic group. There's guy Rabbi Schneerson. They believe this guy who died a few years ago, Rabbi Schneerson, is the Messiah. Now, I met these people, long story, supermarket in New Jersey years ago. I'm vaguely familiar. That's the only reason I know about them. So anyway, The New York Times, Forbes, and the Wall Street Journal had articles. They didn't directly say, but they strongly imply this guy Kolomoisky was laundering money through the sect in Brooklyn and Miami. They didn't directly say it, but they kind of strongly implied. Igor Kolomoisky can't come to the U.S. because of massive corruption charges, but he's living in Switzerland now. Anyway, he essentially astroturfed Zelensky's entire political career. Okay, Kolomoisky was a big backer, big funder of the Maidan uprising. He sponsored several media outlets which are heavily promoting it. He was a big funder, but he also is a funder of the Azov Battalion, Nazi and various ultra-nationalist Ukrainian groups. Ironically, he's Jewish, but he apparently hates Russians. I hate Russia and Russians. I'm not entirely sure why. The ethnic hatred is directed against Russians, not against Jews so much, as far as I know. Interesting, Zelensky, he was a comedian. Before he became president, he had a comedy skit, and there's a clip. It's online. It's online. His skit where he said, in Russian actually, he said, jokes. He was joking. He said, if you want to get rich quick, just seize. It's okay to seize the assets, seize the property of a Russian. We're protected. I mean, we Jews, we're off limits. Kolomoisky's protecting us, but the Russians are a fair target. And he was joking about Nazis. We need more. Please send us more copies of Mein Kampf. We run out of it. He apparently was goofing on stereotypes of Ukraine, which turned out to be largely true. But now this clip is on, there's a YouTube channel, The Convo Couch, and they mention it's in the middle of that. They have this clip. It's freaking bizarre. Okay, so anyway, Kolomoisky had sponsored this TV show called Servant of the People. Zelensky was the star of this Servant of the People. It was a sitcom. The idea was about a school teacher who became president of Ukraine. And apparently it was very popular. It was heavily promoted. People who saw this said it was moderately entertaining, not spectacular, but it was very heavily promoted. And then afterwards, Kolomoisky started a political party, also called Servant of the People, where Kolomoisky ran as the candidate. He ran as a reform candidate, actually, and got support of the Russian-speaking population after they've been through a lot of turmoil since 2014. A lot of Russian-speaking people voted for him, and he very quickly caved. Originally, he apparently was innocent where he actually tried to hold back these Nazi groups, the Azov Battalion. I think he ordered some of these groups to halt their incursion into Donbass, the Russian. He ordered them, and they did a little bit, and then he had a face-off with them. They basically refused to obey orders. He said he had his breakdown. Weird. He said, I'm the president of Ukraine. I'm 41 years old. I'm not a loser. It was weird, but they basically refused to obey orders. And then he quickly caved into them. Later on, he gave the head of the Azov Battalion the highest Medal of Honor of Ukraine, highest Medal of Honor. He completely caved to them. He's a pathetic character. He's a tool. He's a complete tool. He's still an actor. Kolomoisky is believed to be calling the shots, and everything what I've heard, Ukraine's a gangster state. It's a very, very corrupt gangster state. But the one Ukrainian MMA artist who's kind of sympathetic to Russians, the Ukrainian security tortured him and beat him up. There are all kinds of stories. Opposition parties are banned. Opposition politicians are either killed or under house arrest. It's very much of the corrupt, brutal gangster state, kind of like Russia was in the 90s. Okay, that's kind of the background. This Zelensky is a piece of shit. He's a horrible guy. Media builds him up as he had a weird address before Congress. Okay, things about Zelensky. Okay, now some of the meat of this. Two big, really bombshell things came out. Like bad pun, no pun intended, but two big things came out that first there was some buzz going around that the U.S. is involved in biological warfare, bacteriological, biological warfare, research, development, and actual war. Now, I made about 7 or 8 months ago, I don't remember when, I made a video about Lyme disease, which is a disease carried by ticks, spreading rapidly in the Northeast US, really horrible disease. I'm really paranoid, warm weather, I'm constantly checking myself. So I made a video on this. The video was about an hour and 15 minutes. I put a lot of work into it. I got a lot of pushback, but some things. First of all, it is known that the lead head of the Nazi bacteriological warfare program, a guy named Erich Traub, who's a real person, he studied in the U.S., studied genetics, early genetic science before DNA was discovered, but he studied genetics in the U.S. in the 1930s, was involved in Nazi groups, German-American Nazi groups in the U.S., came back to Germany, joined the Nazi Party, became eventually head of the Nazi bacteriological warfare program, which was directed against Russia, against the Soviet Union. As far as I know, it wasn't used, as far as I understand. Then after the war, he came back to the U.S. Operation Paperclip, one of the many Nazi scientists who came back to the U.S. And he worked on, we don't know what he did, but it doesn't sound good. It's pretty heavy shit. We don't know what he did. It is known that the U.S. Was involved in bacteriological warfare in Cuba. The Cuban government says so, and things came out in the Church Committee hearings in the mid-70s. U.S. Was directed against different strains of typhus were released in Cuba, and brucellosis, cow disease, hurt the cattle crop. U.S. has been confirmed. The U.S. has been doing this in Cuba. Anyway, in my video, I talked about speculations. Okay, there's a place called Plum Island off the coast of Long Island. There's a Long Island Sound, then there's Connecticut. Plum Island is technically part of New York State. It's very close to Connecticut. It was long known to doing research in animal diseases, but there was a lot of speculation. I partly grew up in that area, but a lot of speculation for years that they're doing bacteriological warfare research. Their government's obviously not going to publicly mention it. I went to high school with a guy whose parents worked there. I don't know what they did there, but some buzz. So anyway, in the 70s and later identified in the 90s, there was Lyme disease was identified, hit Lyme, Connecticut, which is near Plum Island. Some speculation it was Lyme disease was bacteriological warfare. Form of it, which either was areas were either deliberately infected or got seagulls, migratory birds. They eat shells at these islands and drop it off. Now, I don't know if this is true or not. I got a lot of pushback. Now, I got a lot of pushback. I posted this video on Facebook. I got pushback from people who didn't even watch the video. Now, every time you say CIA or biowarfare, it's conspiracy theory, conspiracy theory. The conspiracy theory trope is used to shut down any speculation of what the ruling class is doing. Oh, conspiracy theory, conspiracy theory. Anytime you mention like Fort Detrick, which is known to be involved in bacteriological warfare research, oh, conspiracy theory, conspiracy theory, you're not decent people, liberals, and even people on the left are not allowed to mention conspiracy theory. It shuts down any speculation. Now, I mentioned there was a big thing in the 2000s, early 2000s, there were congressional hearings. There were books written about it. There was a Newsweek, prize-winning Newsweek, environmental investigative journalist. There was a congressman from New Jersey, a congressman from Connecticut, and there were hearings about this speculation that Lyme disease was spread as part, either accidentally or on purpose, as part of bacteriological warfare research. And I got a lot of pushback on my video from a couple of people. These people, interestingly, later on blocked me and whatever. But I got a lot of I got some pushback. Now, some people have said, Lyme disease existed before. First, Bush got really upset at me. Oh, well, you were talking about some weird Nazi scientists like boys in Brazil. Well, no. Erich Traub was literally the head of the Nazi bacteriological warfare program, and he came to the U.S. and he worked for the freaking CIA. We know this. This is mainstream. But any speculation, oh, a crazy conspiracy theory, you're not allowed to think that. No, well, that idea of Lyme disease I might have been wrong. Now, some people think that Lyme disease existed earlier. Maybe Native Americans had it. Maybe it was in colonial period. One researcher claimed to have found evidence of it in Europe, like 100,000 years ago during the Younger Dryas Ice Age period. I don't know. I haven't delved in. I would love to interview some very well-respected people who are investigating this, and I'd love to interview some of these people, what their current take on is. I'm not going to dismiss this offhand, any idea of conspiracy theory, I'm not going to dismiss it. People think, I think it's very likely the Kennedy assassination was a conspiracy theory. I don't agree with the original Oliver Stone movie. I haven't been a fan of the Kennedys at all. They're pretty shitty people in so many ways. I don't think Kennedy was some secret radical. But the stuff going on, I think it's pretty likely that they had him eliminated. There were factions which didn't like him. I think pretty like it's possible 9/11 was an inside job. It's been such a trope, it's been a trope almost. People make fun of it. I know people on Facebook who every time 9/11 rolls around, they say, I'm going to block anyone who says a 9/11 truth. I'm going to block now. I'm not saying I'm a 9/11 truth. I just haven't delved into it, but I think it's pretty likely some shit went on. Okay. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning that, and I might have been wrong about Lyme disease. I'm not going to die on that hill. And I said in my video, I'm not going to die on this hill, but I think it's open to the idea that Lyme disease was part of bacteriological warfare. Could be totally wrong. And I'm aware of the Snopes and the Washington Post. I've read, I'm aware of that. I'm saying we do have a highly controlled media environment. Okay, first, bacteriological warfare, U.S. biowarfare labs in Ukraine. First, there was some buzz. I watch all alternative media, leftist, libertarian, and moderately conservative, different viewpoints. And people in the comments section would post these comments of a Bulgarian researcher, of a Bulgarian researcher. I forget her name offhand. She's done a lot of independent journalists. She's done research for years on U.S. biowarfare around the world, including Ukraine. And people would post a link to her page, Dilyana. First name is Dilyana. I know I'm going to butcher her last name. Richard Medhurst had a really interesting interview with her, which I'll link. Anyway, people would post things, and there was buzz in the comments section of like YouTubers and bloggers. Actually, YouTubers and bloggers themselves initially didn't want to touch this, didn't mention it. Then it started to come out. Last week, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced they had found. First, before this happened, this guy, American guy, Russell Bentley, really interesting guy, American from Texas who lives in Donbass. He calls himself Tejas from Donbass. Interesting cat. He apparently lived South Padre Island, Texas. He was a beach bum for a while. He was a weed smuggler. He did 5 years in jail for smuggling marijuana. He was a Green Party activist. He became disgusted by the wokeism of the American left. I picked that up too. I've gone to DSA meetings where people like snap their fingers as if clapping their hands. They're super sensitive, and everybody spends the first half hour of a meeting describing what pronouns they want to use. I'm trans myself, but I mean, some of this gets to ridiculous heights. And, ironically, it's pro-imperialist. The DSA goes through all this woke bullshit, but they support imperialism, which is the most bloodthirsty thing on the planet. So anyway, Russell Bentley was kind of disgusted by the wokeism of the left. He's kind of old school. He's kind of old school. Anyway, similarly, he moved to Donbass after 2014, when the conflict was going on, joined a communist group there and fought. Now he's not. He's in the 60s. He's involved in some journalism and relief aid. There are fascinating interviews with him. Max Blumenthal interviewed him. His YouTube channel was taken down, but you can still reach it via VK or other. His videos are really fascinating. Anyway, he mentioned that there are at least 12 U.S. biological warfare labs in Ukraine. He said the Russians took out 7 of them with thermobaric sterilizing missiles. I don't know where he got the information from. I can't verify this. Okay, anyway, a little while later, the Russian Ministry of Defense came out they said they had evidence of 30 U.S. biowarfare installations. Very detailed account. Not that they traced the funding they were doing on the auspices of the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and the U.S. Geological Survey. It's been funded by the CIA, undoubtedly, but they used conduits. They found, anthrax, various vials, anthrax, including coronavirus, various strains they were using, and they found a lot of. Now, the U.S. media was in an uproar. First they adamantly denied it. All the fact checkers, Snopes, absolutely not. No, the U.S. is not, and emphatically, the U.S. does not engage in this stuff. Absolutely not. There, one article they tried to link it to QAnon, the latest Q conspiracy. Oh, isn't this crazy? Latest Q conspiracy. The U.S. is involved in biological warfare in Ukraine. How crazy is that? Army of fact checkers. Okay. Now, Clint Greenwald had a really interesting take. He said, first their overreaction, their super defensiveness was kind of telling. Also, the fact that, how would they know if there's U.S. involved in biological warfare research in Ukraine? It would obviously be top secret. Snopes or Facebook fact checkers are not going to know anything about it, obviously. That was quite interesting. Well, the clincher for me and lots of other people, there was an incident where Victoria Nuland, she was basically orchestrated the Maidan coup in 2014. She's still around. She had an interview. She testified before Congress. Marco Rubio interviewed her. This was fascinating. And Marco Rubio asked her point blank, is the U.S. involved in biowarfare? Does the U.S. have biowarfare installations in Ukraine? I forget how you phrased it. And of course, she was supposed to say, oh, absolutely not. She didn't say this. What she said is, the U.S. has biological research labs in Ukraine, and we can't let the Russians get hold of it. That was a weird answer. Now break that down. Glenn Greenwald and others have broke this down. She was testifying before Congress, so she didn't want to commit perjury. I mean, many politicians have lied before Congress, especially people who are much beloved by the Democratic Party, James Clapper, Mueller. They lied before Congress at different times. But this was a case where Victoria Nuland's lawyers probably, advised her not to. Don't do this. I'm sure she rehearsed her answer. So she didn't deny it, but she deflected. So we have biological research, but we can't let the Russians get hold of it. Deflected to the Russians. And Marco Rubio then his answer was bizarre. He kind of sensed it was fumbled, and he picked up. He said next statement was something like, "It goes without saying the U.S. would never do this, but the Russians would." And she said, "Oh yeah, absolutely." So I had to pick up. That for me, that clinched it. Yeah, the U.S. is fucking involved in this stuff. Yes, no doubt whatsoever. Then a little while, even more recently, the Russian Ministry of Defense released documents that said it's a hard copy, in English. They got the documents confirming that the U.S. is involved in this stuff. And it's on there. They posted on their Telegram channel. I don't get Telegram. I don't understand. I tried to look it up once. I'm sure it's there. And what I've also heard that experts in this field have gone over the documentation. Yes, it's convincing, yes. So I am convinced the U.S. is involved in biological warfare research and implementation in Russia, not just that with these documents released by the Ministry of Defense said, the U.S. has used it against cattle, like they've done Cuba. They've used it. They've released these things in Russia. They've used it. This is a fucking crime against humanity. This is a crime against humanity of huge proportions. If this is true, and I think it is, the Russians were not just justified, they had to invade Ukraine. That is a fucking crime against humanity. Okay, now I get emotional talking about this stuff. Okay, so next thing, the Russian Ministry of Defense claims they have evidence that Ukraine was planning invasion of Donbass, the breakaway Russian-speaking region in the east. They were planning invasion of it by the middle of March. And this would make sense. If you remember, there was very heavy escalation of bombing. There was constant bombing for the last shelling of the last 8 years, but there was a massive escalation for 2 weeks before the Russian invasion. Theory that was done softening up. That was softening up pursuant to an invasion. The invasion would have brought them back into Ukraine. It also massacred the population. The Azov battalions, bitterly anti-Russian Nazi groups, were going to exterminate the population. For the Russian-speaking population, that was in the cards, and the Russians had to. There was a huge media, U.S. media buzz. The Russians going to invade. The Russians, and they said not just that, they set dates, they set times. 3:00 on Tuesday, the Russian invasion will begin. There's always like unnamed U.S. intelligence sources, which is code word for bullshit, but unnamed U.S. intelligence sources say an invasion will come at 3:00 Tuesday morning. Well, that may have been speculation. That may have been political cover to make it more difficult for the Russians to invade, to make it more blocking them, make it more difficult. I don't know what there's weird stuff going on. But yeah, if these two things are true, and I think they are, what else was Russia supposed to do? Hold hands, sing Kumbaya? Like what else? This was an existential threat, not just to the Russian state, not to Putin, not to the Putin regime, but to the Russian people. Biological warfare against the Russian people. Now, my take is, Russia would have been, no, okay, I'll get to that in a minute. So what else was Russia supposed to do? So anyway, there are narratives on the left, which I disagree with. I'll explain some of the narratives. Yeah, no, what I was going to say is Russia would have been in this situation no matter what government they had, what form of government or what social system they had. They could have been a monarchy. They could have been a military dictatorship. They could have been socialist, communist, Scandinavian social democracy, liberal bourgeois democracy. No matter what form of government or socialism they had, they would have been confronted with U.S. imperialism wanting to destroy them. Now, Russia was in a horrific situation in the 90s. U.S. imperialism was, U.S. neoliberalism was forced on them and just enormously destructive. Putin did not want to fight U.S. imperialism. He badly wanted to integrate, and the Russian ruling class wanted to integrate with Western capitalism. They badly wanted to integrate. U.S. wouldn't let them. Like, I think it was John McCain actually said their role was to be, Russia's role was to be a gigantic gas station. That was the only role they would be allowed. They were not allowed to participate in equal level. So the Russian ruling class has been forced into this thing to confront U.S. imperialism. Okay, now narratives on the left, tropes, which I disagree with. I see this all over Facebook and Trotskyists, anarchists, and some Marxist-Leninist groups. Generally, to the civil narratives. First of all, that both Russia and the U.S. are capitalist, and they're both imperialist, and so many people on the left shouldn't take either side. Another narrative related to that is that the Russian and the Ukrainian and Russian working class should unite and overthrow both NATO, push out NATO, and push out the Russians. It's another trope. Another big trope is a more implicit trope is that Russia's fascist. Either leadership is fascist or Russia is riddled with fascists, and it's just the Azov, they're Ukrainian fascists, the Azov battalion, and so on, but they're also Russian fascists as well. Just fascists versus fascists. There's the trope, Spider-Man trope of like one Spider-Man like Azov battalion fighting the Wagner group. Okay, my take on these narratives. I disagree with them or see them differently. My take on these narratives. Yes, absolutely. Russia is capitalist. And again, I have no support, no political support for Putin. I think he's far more sophisticated than any Western leader, vastly more cultured, sophisticated, but I have no political support for Putin. Okay, I don't even like the guy. I have no political support for him. That's not the point. As I said, no matter what form of government or social system Russia would have, they would be confronted with fundamentally U.S. imperialism. Okay, Russia is capitalist, absolutely. The economist Michael Hudson makes the point, though, it's a different type of capitalism from U.S. capitalism. It's not neoliberal. It is more growth-oriented, not neoliberal capitalism. The 70%, according to the IMF, 70% of the Russian economy, of the Russian GDP comes from, my nose is itchy, sorry, 70% of the Russian GDP comes from the private sector. Sorry, 70% of the Russian GDP comes from the state sector. The 12 largest corporations of Russia are state-run. Yes, the commanding heights of Russia are mixed. Much of it is in private hands. Agriculture is privatized. The collective farms have been handed over to agribusiness or whatever. So it is a capitalist. Russia is capitalist. Yes, absolutely. But it's a different type of capitalism. And Russian working class have an interest in fighting neoliberalism. They don't want to go back to the horrible time of the 90s. They do have an interest in fighting U.S. imperialism will not allow Russia as an equal partner at all. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Russia being imperialist, well, U.S. is obviously imperialist. I don't see Russia as imperialist. Now, Russia doesn't fit Lenin's theory of imperialism, like imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, the classic. That was 100 years ago, and I am looking for an updated version of it, but Russia doesn't seem to fit. Russia is not an exporter of capital. Lenin had, imperialism following finance capital. Basically, Russia is not an exporter of capital. They export oil, natural gas, some other things. And apparently they do have something with steel, revived steel industry, as far as I understand, but I don't see Russia as imperialist. They were justified in annexing Crimea. The overwhelming population were Russian speaking and wanted to join Russia, and they should have had that right. When people say Russia is imperialist, they mean Syria. Now, that's a whole huge issue of contention on the left. First of all, I don't like Assad, but keep in mind the U.S. Operation Timber Sycamore, the U.S. spent at least $5 billion and in cooperation with the Gulf states, who spent billions and billions and more, building up, fomenting these vicious jihadi groups. An urban protest movement was very quickly eclipsed by a vicious jihadi civil war. There was no, except at the very beginning, there was no moderate opposition. There was no secular moderate opposition. Now the Free Syrian Army, now today they're still around. They're entirely Al-Qaeda. Seriously, they're run by Turkey, and they're entirely Al-Qaeda. There's no moderate opposition. There's no Syrian revolution. There was an urban protest movement that was very quickly hijacked or maybe fostered by the CIA. The CIA has been heavily involved in Syria ever since the French got out. There's a coup, CIA-backed coup in 1948. There was, as I understand, a botched semi-parliamentary coup in the early 50s, which derailed the whole tradition of civilian government in Syria, and the whole, like Assad, but the whole system emerged in reaction to U.S. imperialism. Syria joined Egypt and the United Arab Republic that time. Keep out U.S. meddling. I mean, the U.S. is behind a lot of this shit. So I think Russians intervened 2014, saved Assad government, and I'm glad they did. They played a very progressive role. They pushed out these jihadis. They pushed them into Idlib safe. They didn't do it because they're revolutionary. They did it because if Syria, if Assad had been overthrown and he came close to in 2014, there would have been, ISIS state, or a jihadi nightmare. It would have been spread like bacteria all over Central Asia. Russia has a large Muslim population, the underbelly of the former Soviet Union. It would have been a nightmare. Russia had a definite interest in stamping that out. And they did. And they're not and they have a lot of respect in the Middle East for doing this. Keep in mind, the U.S. is also occupying 40% of Syria. It's not mentioned in the media at all. Occupying 40% of Syria's land area, not a lot of people, but land area. The U.S. military is occupying deliberately to deny Syria the oil revenue for reconstruction. They're also brutally punished in sanctions, devastate the economy. I mean, come on. Russia, Iran are pushing back, and insofar as they do against U.S. imperialism, insofar as they do, I support them. I don't like the Iranian mullahs. I don't like Putin. That doesn't matter. They're forced by events to push back against U.S. imperialism, and as such, they're helping working people. Now, now most Trotskyist groups have a really, really horrible take on just about everything, which is no way I'm not a member. Let me get my phone. Okay, let me get my phone. Now, Leon Trotsky had an article in 1938 where he had talked about kind of a hypothetical example where there'd be like a fascist Brazil. Brazil had a semi-fascist, Vargas, semi-fascist government. Fascist Brazil had a war against a, quote, democratic England. He said hesitatingly he would support Brazil, not for any support for fascism, but because Britain was like the U.S. is today, the global hegemon, and if they defeated the fascist government in Brazil, they would install something even worse. So what's happening in Ukraine is a proxy war. It's very obviously not just Russia against Ukraine; it's a proxy war. U.S. imperialism against Russia is very obviously a process. Nothing to do with Iran, with Ukraine, but it's a proxy war. If U.S. imperialism wins, they'll force a horrific neoliberal system on Ukraine, and they'll be reinforced on this Ukraine, much of the global South. If Russia wins, not that they're great either, but they'll open a lot more. They'll push back U.S. imperialism. Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, much of the global South, which is under the boot heel of U.S. imperialism, will breathe a sigh of relief. Now, I'm going to read this article from Trotsky, and I am a Trotskyist, but I very much think most of the Trotskyist movement has gone off the rails. Okay, here we go. Leon Trotsky said this and wrote this in 1938, and I'm going to read it. It said, I will take the most simple and obvious example. In Brazil, there now reigns a semi-fascist regime that every revolutionary can only view with hatred. Let us assume, however, that on the morrow, England enters into a military conflict with Brazil. I ask you, on whose side of the conflict will the working class be? I will answer for myself personally. In this case, I will be on the side of, quote, fascist Brazil against, quote, democratic Great Britain. Why? Because in the conflict between them, it will not be a question of democracy or fascism. If England should be victorious, she will put another fascist in Rio de Janeiro and will place double chains on Brazil. If Brazil, on the contrary, should be victorious, it will give a mighty impulse to national and democratic consciousness of the country and will lead to the overthrow of the Vargas dictatorship. The defeat of England will at the same time deliver a blow to British imperialism and will give an impulse to the revolutionary movement of the British proletariat. Truly, one must have an empty head to reduce world antagonisms and military conflicts, the struggle between fascism and democracy. Under all one mask, all one must know how to distinguish exploiters, slave owners, and robbers. And he goes, it's a little different, not exactly the same, of course, but a lot, U.S. took a hit. Had faced a humiliating defeat in Afghanistan. It's to the good if the U.S. faces a humiliating defeat in Ukraine. And I don't like Putin either, but okay. So the trope that the working class should unite, Ukrainian and Russian working class, it doesn't. Should unite and overthrow, kick out NATO, kick out the Russians. It doesn't work that way. It does. It does. A simplistic way of looking at it. The working class organizations, multi-ethnic Russian Ukrainian organizations have been suppressed. The Ukrainian Communist Party, the Borotba struggle, they're both underground. The Party of the Regions, several other parties and politicians have been banned. They're underground. Working class independence doesn't exist, really, is crushed. There'd be a much greater room for working class solidarity once US NATO is defeated in Ukraine. Yeah, I mean, I would see Russia dominate Ukraine to be much more open to class solidarity. That's the way I see it. The reliance on, I once would argue this myself in Libya back in 2000. I actually argued for the Libyan working class too, but there was no Libyan. I mean, it's kind of a right-wing argument disguised as an ultra-left argument. Yes, ideally the working, but I was in the ISO. They used to have the slogan, black and white, unite and fight. Yeah, okay, it's kind of super simplistic. It doesn't, there's a lot more than that. It's a super simplistic argument. Okay. Anyway, so that's, the idea that Russia is fascist. Well, I mean, there are, like, the US police kill on the average. Recent article came out in Left Voice. It was believed the US police kill 1,000 people a year, maybe twice that number, maybe in the average about 2,000 people a year. Most people of color. The US police are heavily infiltrated by fascist groups. I mean, we know this. US military is infiltrated by fascist groups. I mean, we know this. Does this make the US a fascist country? I mean, some of the neocon philosophers are batshit crazy, and they have a lot of power and influence. Does this mean the US is a fascist country? I don't think so. Russia, there are possibly fascistic groups, and I lived in Moscow and I've seen them. There are Russian fascists. I'm not denying they exist. It doesn't make Russia a fascist country. And even if it was, it's still fighting against US, no matter what the form of government is, fighting against US imperialism. I do think Russia is a liberating force in Ukraine. Lots been made of the Wagner group, which basically doesn't exist. It's a mercenary group, supposedly a fascistic mercenary group. Even the Wikipedia article, by the way, Wikipedia is CIA. It's open source. Theoretically, anyone can contribute, but you read, and it's some generally useless reading about a mineral or an extinct species of bird or an obscure language. Yeah, it's sort of, I've gone on Wikipedia binges overnight at 2 or 3 in the morning, researching obscure stuff on Wikipedia. Yeah, but any current political stuff, they fit the narrative, the neoliberal narrative. And they understand, leftist journalists, you read Max Blumenthal, any really leftist journalist who goes against the narrative, they smear them. It's their system of locking contributions, groups of people work on it. One guy has been, writing smear pieces on leftist journalists on Wikipedia, and the author has been traced to his place in Northern Virginia, one individual. And he apparently does this as a full-time job. It's CIA. CIA controls Wikipedia. They control most of the entire US media. And, the narratives they're pumping out fits the neoliberal narrative when he says Russia is fascist. They're the Azov battalion, these neo-Ukrainian Nazis, but the Russians have fascists too. There's this Catherine Askell troll, basically Zionist troll, Facebook troll, post all this pro-NATO stuff and all these things. Right, these fascist Russians. I think it's mostly bullshit. There are fascistic groups and there are some crazy nationalists, but in Russia, like any place else, the security state, the military, anywhere in the world has these people. But it doesn't make Russia fascist. And I don't politically support Putin, but Russia, no matter what government they have, they're up against U.S. imperialism. They're up against U.S. imperialism, and that's the important thing. And a multipolar world would get the jackboot of the empire off the global south. This is what we have to work on, and anywhere else too. Okay, so those big narratives I disagree with. I see this everywhere. They're kind of simplistic, don't really make sense, and totally missing the point. I see what choice did Russia have now. There's some speculation too. The Russian sanctions are pretty crippling, and the sanctions against Russia, they're kind of bizarre too. There's discrimination, like Russian composer was being fired. Russian people in the West are being fired if they have to go along with the narrative. They support their government, they're fired. It's so fucking weird. It's like Russophobia is weird up like Islamophobia was after 9/11. If you say you're Russian, it could be really dangerous. Russian stores have been vandalized, and it's really horrible. So there's some speculation the sanctions against Russia may boomerang against the West, even may discredit the use of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Really complicated. Michael Hudson and others have done an interesting analysis of it. The use of petrodollars is what they call the U.S. went the Bretton Woods system, like 30 years or so, a couple of decades after the Second World War, collapsed by the early mid-70s. There's something called, some people call Bretton Woods II. The petrodollar system emerged by the 1980s. Saudi Arabia recycles dollars. People buy dollars around the world, buy oil around the world using dollars. Dollars the world's reserve currency, which props up the value of the dollar. The U.S. is massively living beyond its means, is very heavily in debt. If the U.S. was a developing country in the global south, we'd have the IMF out our throats, and we'd probably occupied all kinds of sanctions. But U.S. is top dog, U.S. can do anything it wants. One of the functions is the military imperialism. So this may be eroding. Interesting, Saudi Arabia, which is a fucking horrible state. They recently beheaded 81 people. Horrible country. Saudi Arabia apparently making a deal with China, or the articles say they're discussing paying for oil in yuan. What this really means is they're dumping the dollar. It's code. It goes really stronger than that. They're actually going to start paying the Chinese in yuan. Other countries, they're moving. Saudi Arabia is pissed off at the U.S. The Khashoggi incident. Khashoggi was the son of a major arms merchant, actually. I think his name is Adnan Khashoggi. He was a Washington Post journalist and liberal. He was high up, well liked by the Beltway Democratic Party, the Beltway blob, Democratic Party crowd. Very well liked. He was a liberal imperialist, I guess, not in great shakes. I haven't read his stuff, but he went to Turkey to get basically he went to the Saudi consulate in Turkey to get a visa for his fiancee to marry, something like that. And they killed him. They very grisly murder. And it's just the Democrats really like Khashoggi, that in a lot of journalists, like Democratic Party aligned journalists really like this guy. Pressure on the Biden administration. He criticized Saudi Arabia, not over some of the shit they're actually doing, but because of the Khashoggi killing, which was pretty horrific, absolutely was pretty horrific. So there's been something of a rift, and the Saudis or the Saudi leadership, guy Mohammed bin Salman, Mr. Bonesaw, people call him, he's pissed off the U.S. and making nice to China. That's one thing. This was accelerated by the Ukraine situation. Many countries are really appalled that the U.S. is so sanction crazy, sanctioning just about everybody. U.S. is now ruling by brute force, doesn't have the soft power anymore, where the U.S. is ruling by brute force, and much of the global south is turning against, like the UN. India, which is kind of a U.S. ally, voted against or abstained in UN votes. Other countries, this is beginning of a shift. This could represent the beginning. The sanctions are hurting Russia, but it could be the beginning of a geopolitical tectonic shift, and maybe the end of the empire, which would be a very good thing. I don't have all the answers. I don't know. I'd just like to end this by saying media outlets I get my information from. Do not watch CNN or MSNBC or that. They're horrible. They won't tell you what's happening. But what I get it from a variety of sources. I don't fully agree with everything they say. Some things I totally disagree, but I think they do give that more source of information anyway. Okay, first a blog called Moon of Alabama. German guy named Bernard. I don't know his last name. Bernard. I think he's a retired aerospace engineer. Blog is in English. Is very well interested. Very well done. The comment section, like a couple. The blogs often have commenters of a community of people commenting on it, and there's some of these commenters are really interesting as well. Scan through that. Moon of Alabama is a really good resource. Another one is blog is Vineyard of the Saker. A Russian, or apparently he's Russian Swiss guy who actually lives in Florida, St. Petersburg, Florida. He's a Russian nationalist. And he's a bit eccentric. He married an American woman. He's a bit eccentric, but he has a variety of writers and really up to the date, very pro-Russian, Russian nationals, but up to the date information on what's happening, speculation, and leftists write for him. Pepe Escobar, Michael Hudson, the economist, a variety of leftists write for him. He had an interview with Roger Waters from Pink Floyd. He has some interesting stuff. He's anti-imperialist. I mean, he's not a leftist really, but he's anti-imperialist. That's an interesting source. Another one is a guy named Gonzalo Lira, who's an American, Chilean-American writer, filmmaker. He's been living in Ukraine for the last 10 years. His wife and kids are Ukrainian. He's in, I forget the name of the city, but northern Ukraine. He's a city right now is holding up. He had a story of the Banderites, fascist group, were tried to kill him. He had his clip, which was a video, which was construed as being pro-Russian. It was chopped up in Russian media broadcast in Russia. And then it was rebroadcast back to Ukraine. Some of these Banderite groups found out about it, and they were chasing after him. They came to his apartment. The concierge told him no shit. So he's still in the city, but he's underground right now. He still makes videos. Fascinating guy. He's not a leftist. He's kind of a libertarian, moderately conservative libertarian, but he's highly intelligent guy, really streetwise. So he's a good resource. Another one is the Duran. There are two guys who are Greek nationalists, one Greek American, the other Greek Cypriot British guy, Alexander Macoris. A lot of his conclusions are just wrong. Like he predicted, like when this whole thing started, well, if nothing happens by Wednesday, it'll go away. Okay, that obviously many of his takes, predictions are wrong. But having said this, he's chock full of information, extremely knowledgeable. It's worth it to watch it. Talk about the diplomacy. So these are some of the sources I use. Another variety of YouTube is Richard Medhurst has a series of things on this. Richard Medhurst's YouTube channel, The Gray Zone, Breakthrough, a variety of other sources of interviews and takes on it. Jimmy Dore, and it's worth checking. That's why I use alternate media sources. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed my video. And you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. Maybe next week I'll do a video on Yemen. Anyway, thank you very much.